Welcome back to Flux's How-To series. In today's video, we're going to be covering how to set up and use your consent forms. First, we'll want to log into Flux as an administrative user, and then locate the settings icon in the top left, and then finally, clicking on your consent forms section on the left-hand side. This is your consent forms setting page. This will allow you to create, view, and edit any current or new consent forms that you might create. To create your own consent form, navigate to the plus icon, and once you click on that, it'll open up our editor. From the editor, you'll be able to set a title, enter in information for the consent form, and utilize the formatting bar, which can allow you to bold, underline, italicize, highlight, justify, insert into tables, text boxes, bigger text boxes, an area text box, check marks, links, photos, videos, and also HTML if you know HTML code. Once you're done, you can click Save Changes at this window, and then you'd be able to hit Save Settings here as well, which would save your custom consent form. If you'd like to utilize Flux's pre-made templates, you can find them by selecting the dropdown. And for this example, let's use the consent for scaling and route planning. We select that, and then navigate to the pencil icon, which will allow us to edit and view the consent form. You can change any of the text inside that's already created for you, and you can set a new title if you'd like to, as well as, again, using the formatting bar to adjust it to your liking. If you make any changes, just make sure you hit Save. You'll get a prompt that says your consent form has been saved. You can close this window, and then hit Save Settings again in Flux. Another feature that Flux allows is for you to link your consent forms via proc code and category, and that will allow you to automatically attach consent forms to treatments as long as those categories or codes are present. To do so, you'll want to select your consent form from the dropdown. We'll stick with our scaling and route planning for now, and then we can navigate to the link icon. Once selected, you'll be presented with this window. For the purposes of this video, I've already attached some treatment codes to this consent form, as you can see with the list here. However, if you'd like to add more, you can simply search, and you can filter by typing in text, or you can scroll your master list. If you'd like to remove any of the codes, you can simply click the X, and that's the same for the categories as well. Once you're done, you can hit Save Changes in the window, and then again also hit Save Settings in Flux. Another feature that Flux allows is for you to create keywords for specific consents. Again, we'll use the scaling and route planning. And if you attach these keywords to any of your automation, and that'll be inside of your reminders and confirmations as well as your forms tabs, this consent form will be attached to all patients that get that automation. A typical use case for this feature is your COVID-19 consent form, which most practices want to include on every appointment. If you'd like more information on how to utilize the link to treatment feature or the keyword feature seen here, please look at the links below this video in the Help Center, and that'll redirect you to those specific links. For the purpose of this video, we'll continue with the other basic functions. You'll notice next to the keyword icon, there is an eyeball icon, which is to allow you to enable or disable your consent forms. This is a way to hide a specific consent form from your patient profile drop-down list instead of deleting it entirely and having to create it later on. So let's say for now, my practice does not have any need for the consent for scaling and route planning. I can click on this eyeball, and now it is hidden, and you'll notice that the eyeball is faded with a light gray color. Later on in this video, we'll show you the list of consent forms from the patient profile and how enabling or disabling with the eyeball icon changes that page. Finally, the last icon on this row is to delete the consent form entirely. So if we select the consent we want from the dropdown and then hit the delete button, it will be deleted. Please note that this cannot be undone, so please always make sure that you have no use for this consent form in the future. If you believe you may have use for it, use the eyeball icon to hide it from the list. There are 3 toggles underneath the icons. One is to log out of Flex when opening a consent form. If you're a practice that utilizes tablets in-house and you hand your tablets to patients, we suggest always enabling this feature as it is on by default. That way, when your patient completes their consent form, they are logged out of Flex and cannot go into different areas of Flex on their own. Underneath this toggle is to automatically display a provider signature on consent forms, and we'll go through how to sign a consent form from the patient perspective and show you the differences when this is on or off. By default, this feature is off, and so your consent forms will only show one signature box for the patient. But if this is on, there will be a secondary box for the provider to sign as well. You can pair this feature with the one below it, which is to hold consent forms for the provider signature. If this toggle is enabled, Flex will not send the signed consent form by the patient to your practice management system. Instead, Flex will hold these consent forms until the provider signs them, and then it will automatically send it over to your PMS. The last option on this list is your consent email subject line, and you'll want to typically have your practice name here. We'll use John Dental in this case. And then you can always edit the consent email with the button here. This will load our editor, and you'll be able to customize this to your liking. Again, with any setting changes, make sure you hit Save Settings on the bottom right. Now that we know how to add, edit, and configure some of these settings, let's find out where you can access these so your patients can sign them either in-house or sending them via text or email to your patients. You want to navigate back home. And in this case, we'll use our test patient located here. We'll pull up the patient profile. To access your consent forms, click on the CC icon on the top left, and this will present you with all of your active or not hidden consent forms. You'll notice that the scaling and route planning consent form is not on this list, and that's because we use the eyeball icon to hide it. But if we go back to our settings, into our consent form section, select the scaling and route planning consent, and make it visible again, and hit save. If we go back to that same list, that same patient, you'll notice that the consent form is now there, and we can see it here. From this list of consent forms, you can select one or multiple consent forms and either have your patient sign it in-house on hardware, such as a computer or tablet. You can send it to them via text or via email. To select multiple consent forms, simply select them here, and you'll notice they highlight in blue. So in this case, I'm going to be sending my patient the auth form, the consent for endodontic treatment, the consent for veneers, and then the consent for scaling and route planning that we've been playing with in this video. For each of these consent forms, if you need to add a tooth number, you can click the plus icon here, and you'll be brought up with a chart. If I click tooth 11 and hit plus, I can now leave with the X, and tooth 11 is now here. You can do that for any consent form, and you can do multiple teeth if you'd like to. At the bottom of this list, you'll have three options. One is to email the consent, one is to text the consent, and one is the pencil icon to sign now, which is utilizing, again, hardware in the office like a tablet. To email or text a consent form or any form in Flex to your patient, Flex will make sure that there is a valid mobile number and there's a valid email depending on which method you're choosing. If there is not one, you'll get an error prompt. So if I wanted to go ahead and try to email a consent to this patient, you'll notice that my patient doesn't have an email address, so I get an error prompt here that says, this patient does not have an email address. We can hit OK, go into our practice management system, and enter in a valid email address, and then this method would work. Luckily, our patient does have a valid mobile number, so if we click the text icon, you'll see the phone number listed at the top with the message that's going to be sent, and we can hit send. Once we hit send, you'll get the consent send successful prompt, and you can hit OK. If we'd like a patient to sign the consent in-house, let's see what that looks like. So if we go back to our consent list, and for this, let's stick with the scaling and route planning consent, and we'll hit sign now. The consent form will populate, and the patient can freely sign with the touchscreen on the tablet or with the mouse on a computer. Once they hit submit, it'll give you a successful prompt listed here, and the patient can hit OK. And you'll notice that we're now logged out of Flex because of that setting in our consent form section. Once we log back in, we'll now notice that there is a Sign Consent Forms icon here. This is because of the Hold for Provider Signature setting that we had enabled in the consent section as well. So if we click on this, we'll get a list of all the patients who have signed a consent form, but the provider has not yet. So if we click on the test, which was today, you'll see the patient signature, and now the provider can sign. Once they submit, you'll get another successful prompt, and now that consent form is gone from the list and will be in your practice management system. If there was a mistake with a consent form, or perhaps the patient signed more than one of the same consent form, you can always select the delete icons on the right-hand side. But let's say we don't want to wait for the provider to go through this icon, and your provider is next to your patients in most situations, and you want them to sign at the same time. So if we go back to our settings, into our consent form section, we'll see here again, automatically display the provider signature on the consent forms. So if we enable this and hit save, and we go back and repeat the process with our test patient and have him sign the consent form, you'll notice now by default, the provider signature is below the patient signature. So if you sign both, you'll get the same loading animation with a successful prompt, and that consent form is now directly in your practice management system. If both of those boxes are showing by default, both the patient and the provider signature box, and the provider does not sign it, it will then go back into this icon because it did not capture a provider signature. Finally, the last step is to decide where you want your signed consent forms to go in your practice management system. To do so, as long as you are on an admin account, click on Settings, go to the Server tab, and you'll be able to scroll down, and in your Documents section here, for your consent forms, you can select where you would like them to go. If you have multiple different folders in your practice management system, they'll show up in this drop-down list, or you can create one. Like in my example, I do not have a consent forms folder by default. I can go to my practice management system, create a consent forms folder, save that, then select it here from the drop-down. That way, I know exactly where all my consent forms are going. And again, make sure you hit Save Settings anytime you change a setting. And that covers the entirety of the consent form section.